Hello, this is Stéphane Prévost. I am going to talk to you today about language and thinking modes. But before we do that, we're going to take a little bit of a detour and talk about what are called open complex systems. Imagine an orchestra. As you're looking at this orchestra, you're going to see that the orchestra has different sections. It has the first violins, the second violins, the third violins, the cellos, the violas, the trumpets, the flutes, and so on. It has many different sections of instruments. Now, the way that these instruments play, if you are motivated to buy a ticket to listen to a symphony, has to be in a very particular way. In other words, the different sections of the orchestra, they are each playing their individual tunes. So each section plays a different tune. However, at the same time, they are connected with each other. In other words, they don't just play anything, but the tunes that they are playing are harmonized with each other, not only by the composer, but also by the way that they are interpreting the music. So, in other words, what makes the music beautiful to listen to is the fact that the orchestra players have the ability to be their own individual, unique instrument, to play their own individual, unique tune, but at the same time to be connected with each other. So this process of having each their individual tune, we call that differentiation. Each one is differentiated from the other. However, at the same time, they also have to be connected. We call that linkage. So in order for an orchestra to sound good, you'd want to have a balance between linkage and differentiation. Imagine for a moment that the violins and the trumpets decide to just play whatever they want, and the rest plays the symphony. You would hardly buy a ticket for that because it would sound awful. What would you have if the different sections play whatever they want? You would have too much differentiation, too much uniqueness. In other words, you would have chaos. On the other hand, if several sections decided to play exactly the same tune, it would also not be very pleasant to listen to because it would be boring. You would have too much linkage, and that is called rigidity. So when you have an imbalance between differentiation and linkage, you're going to have on one hand chaos when there's too much differentiation, and on the other hand you will have rigidity when there is too much linkage. So the way that looks like is that the energy flow, if we apply that to our organism, to our brain, to our mind, the energy flow of our organism is organized in exactly the same way. It consists of many different parts. It's extremely complex. The brain and the mind are the most complex organ and phenomena in the known universe, and so they are extremely complex, and there is many parts, like in the orchestra, but much more complex. There are many parts that interact with each other. Now, again, when these parts interact with each other optimally. That means that there is a balance between differentiation and linkage. Then we do have a balance between, you can see here on the left side of the of that window, you have a balance between order on the left side and variation on the right side. So you have a balance between linkage and differentiation, between order and variation, between sameness and randomness. And when you have that balance, we call that integration. The system is integrated. And when it comes to medicine or psychology, integration of our nervous system, of our mind, of our body means, medically speaking, psychologically speaking, well-being, ease, health, or manageable effort. Now, it happens, of course, sometimes, that these complex systems are not optimally balanced. In other words, that we fall into states where there's too much linkage, and we fall into states of rigidity, or there is too much differentiation, and then we fall into states of chaos. When that happens, we say that our energy flow flows outside of the window of tolerance. The window of tolerance, what does that mean? It means that the way that our energy flows optimally is like the Goldilocks zones. Our energy flow is not too wild, but it also is not too soft, too tame, but has a nice balance between activation and calmness. And we feel that we are in control. The moment our energy flow falls outside of the window of tolerance, we feel stressed. We either feel stressed in an activated way, and we get panicked and anxious, or we feel stressed in a depressing way, in a dissociated way, and we kind of pull down, we freeze, we become lethargic. So when our energy flow falls into a state of chaos, as you can see on the right, there's excessive differentiation. What happens is that we experience ourselves in a state of agitation, of panic, of pain, disease, and fight-flight. On the other hand, when there's too much linkage, then we experience ourselves in a state of rigidity, stiffness, numbness, also pain, disease, and freeze. So if you look at all the different illnesses that we can have, whether it's medical or psychological, you can say that they could all be categorized as states of rigidity or states of chaos. To give you some examples, anxiety, panic attacks are states of chaos. Depression is a state of rigidity. Obsessive compulsive disorder is a mixed state of chaos and rigidity. An acute inflammation is a state of chaos. A chronic a chronic arthritis where a joint can't move very much anymore, that would be a state of rigidity. So the art, of course, and that's what we address, or that's what we work on when we learn how to practice mindfulness meditation, or when we go into psychotherapy and work with a psychotherapist, is that we learn to use our mind to rewire the brain in such a way that when we fall into states of chaos, we can move ourselves back into the window of tolerance, of integration. Or if we fall into states of rigidity, the same thing, we can move back into a state of integration. And of course, we can never live our lives constantly in a state of integration. We'll occasionally fall into chaos or rigidity. But the idea is that even if that happens, when we have the practice of being connected to ourselves and having the capacity to better regulate our energy flow, we do not stay stuck in those states of rigidity and chaos as much. We move into them, recognize them, and move back out of them in due time without staying stuck in them, because it's the staying stuck in those states that creates chronic stress and breakdowns. So now, of course, you may be wondering, my intention was to talk to you about language modes and thinking modes. What does that have to do with language modes and thinking modes? Well, let's go to the next slide. Human beings have the capacity to engage in different language modes. And of course, language is an expression of how we think. And so language modes are in fact also thinking modes. So the way we talk expresses how we think. And of course, when we can, what we think gets expressed in language. Now, let's just have a look at these different language modes that we are capable of using. The first language mode that I will not comment too much on is the conversational, as you can see on the left. The conversational language mode of everyday life is a language mode that is very complex, because depending on what we do, depending on who we are talking to, depending on what we need to achieve by speaking, by thinking, we employ very different kinds of language modes in any time during the day. So the feeling that comes from the language mode is very varied. Everyday living is the subject. And so that's a very complex and mixed kettle of fish, so to speak. But let's move to the descriptive language mode. Now that one is an interesting one, because as the word says, the descriptive language mode would be, for example, something like this. If you look on the left, she parked her car in the mall parking lot, went into a store to do some shopping, and when she came back to her car, one of the tires was flat. Another example would be, can you please bring me my glasses that are upstairs on my night table? Yet another example, this fall the United States is poised to have a rematch of Biden and Trump for the presidency. Another one, atoms are made of electrons, protons, and neutrons. And then finally, the Second World War is characterized by the Nazi atrocities against Jews. So these are 5 examples of the descriptive language mode. Now, what's characteristic about the descriptive language mode? What's characteristic is that the currency of this language mode is fact. In other words, each sentence corresponds to a fact that can be fact-checked. In other words, the criterion of truth is whether it corresponds to external reality. As you can see in these stories, each sentence, in order to be true, has to correspond to reality. So the sentence about the Second World War is a historical fact. You can check that out, and it corresponds to an external fact. If I ask you to go upstairs and get my glasses, you simply have to follow the sentence, to follow my instructions, and there is actually an external reality that corresponds to my words, and you will find my glasses, and so on. So that's the criteria of truth. Now, what does the descriptive mode appeal to? It appeals to a correspondence to the physical world. And the feeling of it, the feeling of the descriptive mode is neutral and objective. It is just what it is. Examples of subjects that are written or that are expressed in the descriptive mode are science or history, for example. Now, let's move to the conceptual mode. Now, the conceptual mode has as its currency the concept, an internal concept. And the criteria of truth is not so much an external fact, external reality, but it is the coherence and the logic within the sentences. So let's take, for example, this one. Embracing life's complexity makes your life simpler. Looking at life simplistically makes your life more complicated. Or another example, the relationship we have to religion is a contradictory one. Those for whom religion is not a necessity are, for that reason, the very ones for whom religion is a necessity. So you can see that these sentences require an internal logic that is coherent. If there was no internal logic, then we wouldn't understand what it meant. So in this conceptual mode of language or thinking, we can see that it appeals to argument or to reason. It's coherent, it's logical, and it is based on concepts. Example of that would be philosophy. Now there's another language mode, which is the ideological. Now that's an interesting one because the currency of that one is ideology. And the criteria of of truth here, or you know that it is true when it initiates a personal engagement. Again, let me give you an example here. Now, even as we speak, there are those who are preparing to divide us, the spin masters, the negative ad peddlers, who embrace the politics of anything goes. Well, I say to them tonight, there is not a liberal America and a conservative America. There is the United States of America. There is not a black America, a white America, a Latino America, and an Asian America. There is the United States of America. You probably recognize that from many years ago, the first big speech by Obama. So when you hear that language mode, you realize that it initiates you to a personal engagement. In fact, when it does, then that ideology is seen as being true. Again, when we look at the descriptive, it is true when it corresponds to an external fact. When we looked at the conceptual, it is true when it is coherent and logical. And here it is true when it engages us personally in this ideology. In other words, it appeals to commitment and to belief. And the feeling of the ideological is emotional. The descriptive is neutral and objective. The conceptual is rational and objective. And here the ideological is very emotional. We are emotionally engaged. Now, there are two kinds of ideological language modes that can be used, or the ideological language mode can be used in two different ways. You can see here in the first one, it would be more a literary or imaginative way. In other words, this ideological mode would inspire us, what we should allegorically believe. In other words, it doesn't really tell us what to do, but it inspires us to be the best of the best we can be. And it really focuses on the individual to be the best that the individual can be. The second possibility is more nefarious, and that is the more ideological and persuasive one. Here, the social function of this ideology is coercion and control. In other words, it tells you what you should ideologically or from the point of view of the ideology morally do. It has the goal of having you do what the ideology wants you to do. And it is not really focused on the well-being or on the individually to be the best that they can. It is focused on the individual to give up his or her own individuality for the sake of following the social norm of this ideology. And finally, I am going to focus on the imaginative language mode. This imaginative language mode has the currency of the imagination. Now, that's the language modes that has as a criteria of truth the conceivable and the hypothetical. In other words, it appeals to faith, intuition and above all to a sense of meaning. When you hear imaginative language, it sounds true to you when it gives you a sense of meaning. For example, you go to the theater and you hear a piece of Shakespeare. It simply intuitively inspires you and gives you a sense of meaning. Here an example. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty, darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. So that's one example. Another example would be Mr. Duffy's peculiar habit involved composing short autobiographical sentences about himself in the third person and past tense. He never gave alms to beggars, walked resolutely, and carried a stout hazel. His face, etched with the years, bore the brown tint of Dublin streets, while his eyes, framed by the tawny eyebrows, reflected both vigilance and disappointment. In essence, he lived at a slight remove from his own body, observing his actions with skeptical glance. You recognize, of course, a passage from the Bible and a passage from James Joyce. So the imaginative language mode is playful, and examples of this would be literature, scripture, religion would be example of this. So now that we have an overview of these language modes, why is it important to understand these language modes and actually to be able to apply using them in your everyday life? Well, I took this detour, you remember, about the open complex system and the importance with the energy flow of our lives to be able to differentiate and link the different aspects and parts of who we are in such a way that they can move to integration, and that as best we can, we don't fall into states of too much linkage and rigidity or too much differentiation and chaos. This principle now applies to these language modes. We are using these language modes all the time, or we are consuming them all the time. And so it is very important, because these language modes are not completely separate from each other. Like a spectrum, they interweave, particularly in the conversational mode of our everyday life. They interweave, and we need to have the capacity to differentiate these language modes, but at the same time to also see how they are connected in order to make sense of reality. When we don't, we really get into trouble. You're going to ask me, well, how? Well, I'll give you an example. If, for example, you read the Bible, which is, as we said, a text written in the imaginative mode of language. It is about the imagination, the conceivable, and the hypothetical. It gives us a sense of meaning. If you read the Bible like unfortunately so many people mistakenly do, as if it was descriptive language. In other words, a text of history, a historical text, then you just are going down the wrong path. First of all, as a historical text, it makes no sense, because you are not going to find much of anything in the Bible as a historian when you start to go and explore the archaeological sites. Number two, you're going to completely miss the message of the Bible, which is not a history, but it is a story meant to inspire you towards a life of meaning. So that would be one example. Another example is when you listen to some speeches, particularly in the political arena these days. These speeches, of course, they would be within the language mode of ideology. So they are meant to initiate personal engagement on your part. However, when you listen to these speeches, particularly certain politicians more than others, they are very good at inspiring you, in initiating engagement. It's like they engage you emotionally. But when you listen to the content, you're going to see that very often what should be descriptive facts are total lies, and you're also often going to see that the sentences, in terms of the conceptual coherence and logic, they don't make any sense. So you have speakers who are very good at ideologically engaging you, but if you listen carefully, you see that the descriptive and the conceptual is completely jumbled, is completely wrong, makes no sense. Those are very dangerous. The demagogues, they are specialists doing that. They count on people not really listening. They count on people not really paying attention. They count on people being literally stupid to move them into their ideology. Now, you do have other speakers who don't have that problem, who can really engage you in their, let's say, inspirational ideology, but at the same time, when you listen to their content, the facts that they cite are actually accurate. So the descriptive language used is intact, and also their sentences, their trains of thoughts, they make conceptual, coherent sense. Those are the kind of speakers that is lovely to listen to and from which we can really learn, as they are teachers that have a lot to tell us. So you can see I could give many other examples of how these different language modes are not well differentiated, are mixed up, are used wrongly. And so we have a lot of that in the world out there, where the descriptive, the conceptual, the ideological, and the imaginative are not well differentiated, and there's a lot of rigidity in forcing you to see things a certain way, and if you don't, you're the enemy. Or where there's not enough linkage and it's chaotic, and then it's impossible to make sense of it. So as you start now listening to speeches, listening to teachers, to politicians, and so on, start paying attention to these different language modes, and whether you can see an integration between them with a balanced degree of differentiation and linkage, or whether there's a lot of chaos and rigidity that is implicated in the speech. Thank you for listening.